What is up, guys, and welcome back to B73, where today I have a day off. Imagine that. So I thought I'd make a video about what is the method where airlines, and through proxy of airlines, the pilots, fly the most economical, cost-effective and profit-driven way in terms of speed and altitude that we fly. And a caveat to this is, what are the scenarios where we'll actually ditch this entire strategy altogether for other operational reasons? And before I get into all of it, I just want to take 15 seconds to say thank you very much to everyone who's been engaging with such fantastic questions. The comments section's been pretty awesome. I've got people from all parts of the industry that are sharing and providing information to other people from real world experiences, people from ATC and students, flight simmers, and just generally people who are interested or passionate about aviation and sharing knowledge. So it's really fantastic. So yeah, if you do like this content, please do throw a subscribe if you're into technical Boeing 737 or just aviation content in general. And without any more stalling on that, let's talk about the video. So what is the method by which we fly the most economical airplane possible? And that is through what's called the cost index. Now, what is cost index? It's basically a numerical value in modern airliner jets. So Airbus and Boeing, I don't know about other airplanes, but Airbus and Boeing, and it's a value from 0 to another fixed figure. I know for Airbus it goes from 0 to 999, and for Boeing planes it either goes from 0 to 200 or 0 to 400. It sort of depends on what FMC version that the aeroplane's running. And basically 0 just means to fly the cheapest flight possible, which is usually the lowest fuel burn possible for that flight. And then obviously all the way up to the maximum, where you're obviously flying super fast, but with other motivations for that reason to fly fast. And we'll talk about that now. So cost index is calculated usually by in-house proprietary software that airlines will build over years of internal data that they generate based on all the different cost variables that exist inside the airline. The three main cost variables are obviously fuel, which is highly cyclical, changes all the time. Your cost of labor, so your staff, which is obviously your pilots, your cabin crew, as well as other staff members involved with the dispatch of the flight. And then the last one is usually maintenance. There's all sorts of other cost variables, and that's why it's usually proprietary, and airlines keep that software themselves. There's also other third-party providers like ForeFlight, and Boeing has got an off-the-shelf product that airlines can purchase. But these days, a lot of the big airlines will have their own software where before the flight, they'll calculate, this is the number we want you to fly at. So let's use some examples of why an airline might use a high number versus a low number. And to understand that, we need to think about what are the costs of that airline. So if you happen to live in, say, a geography or just a landscape where your fuel is incredibly cheap, this typically exists for a lot of the Middle Eastern carriers, you're more incentivized to burn more fuel and get places quickly to minimize your cost of labor. So typically you'll see very high cost index numbers of 100 or higher. And that's a non-linear scale. So typically once you get above 100, it starts to flatten out. You're just throwing money at the problem, burning fuel, and not typically going that much quicker. So it's very rare to see cost index numbers above 100. Versus other parts of the world where fuel is very expensive, where you'll usually see something between 10 and 30. And then of course there's other scenarios where we might actually modify that based on day-to-day operations, where let's say there's some sort of reason why the schedule's been delayed and we want to actually make up time for that schedule, in which case there might be a fixed delayed cost index where, you know, some airlines, I think Southwest does it, where they've got a procedure where they'll say, all right, if it's a standard operation, we're on time, we're going to fly at a cost index of 18. But if there's any sorts of delays at all, we'll actually just default that to 30 or 50, something like that. So that's basically what cost index. Now, what is the output of cost index when we put it into the FMC? And that is a optimum altitude and basically an econ speed, which is a Mach number, as well as indicated airspeed on descent. Now, if we're trying to fly faster for some reason, let's say, you know, our cost of labor is very high, we want to minimize flight times or some other motivation to fly quickly, the optimum altitude that the FMC spits out is going to be substantially lower, and it's going to be recommended you to be flying at a very high N1 speed, very high, that's your engine RPM speed basically, and a high Mach number. Conversely, if we wanted to use a low cost index number, more than likely it'll be recommending quite a relatively slow Mach number and a higher altitude. So that's the output. It really just, it's a climb, cruise and descent speed in VNAV through econ. And there's some other nuances to that, which I'll do in future videos to do with VNAV, because it is a very powerful sort of component of FMSs, modern FMSs. And particularly once you start to get into the much more modern FMSs, like the modernized 747, as well as the 777 FMCs, where they actually go one step beyond that, and they'll have not just optimum, but also recommended. And in future videos, I'll go in detail about this, but that's when we're starting to use winds and temperatures and start to use blends of the actual conditions that the airplane is experiencing with what has been loaded with ACAR's wind forecasts. And it's basically making a projection of where we should climb compared to what we initially had in our flight plan published at dispatch. So that's basically what cost index is. It's sort of amalgamating all this data to say this is the figure that we should fly for the type of, well, ultimately the minimum cost to the airline. It might not be the minimum fuel cost, but overall, taking in all variables of what the airline has to pay for, it will output the lowest cost speed and altitude. Now, what are the three things that typical scenarios where on day-to-day ops, we actually just can this entire procedure? It's no longer valuable to us, and there's now priorities that take precedence over flying at the minimum cost speeds. And examples of this are curfews. So you can imagine, say there's some sort of delays. Typically you wouldn't schedule a flight to land after curfew, but say, you know, you're scheduled to arrive 30 or 40 minutes before a curfew at an airport, and for some reason throughout the day you've accumulated delays and it's looking like you're not going to make that destination anymore because of curfew. Well, oftentimes it's far more punishing to the operator to fly to that destination, miss out for some reason. You're going to land 5 minutes after curfew, but you would have saved fuel because you're flying at econ speed with a low cost index. That can be far more punishing than completely ditching this strategy altogether and just flying at a fixed, very low, very fast altitude. It's quite common, and I've done it before, where you'll scrap the flight plan, or you might talk to dispatch and through discussions with them say, hey, let's do a 25,000 feet flight plan and fly at, I don't know, something like 0.8 or something like that Mach, which you know, is generally quite quick for a 737. And often those times you'll end up making up, let's say on a 1 hour flight, you could make up 5 or 10 minutes even, especially if you're staying out of high headwinds at higher altitudes. And that could be very valuable to the overall operation, because now you have that aeroplane in the port ready for schedules tomorrow, as opposed to being one aeroplane down and having to somehow fumble around and find a new aircraft to operate the service that jet would have done. So that's one example. Another one would be slot times. So particularly at busy airports, you'll have a slot time. There's even some called TOBTs and TSATs. And I could do another video discussing those and their goals and ambitions of trying to make airplanes more efficient traffic-wise. But let's just say you've been allocated a slot time, you're airborne, you need to typically lose time rather than make up time. And obviously if you're flying an econ speed and you need to lose 7 minutes and there's only half an hour left or 40 minutes left, you're just going to have to manually enter a speed and altitude, or initially speed, and then you may need to descend to fly slower, or you can basically decide to completely scrap econ altogether and fly faster if you had an earlier slot time, but that's very rare. It's more common than not. Probably 3/4 of the time you're actually having to slow down. So those are a couple of scenarios. There's all sorts of other caveats to that. If you're flying in an emergency situation, obviously the cost of the flight goes out the window, and depending on the type of non-normal situation, you might be flying at long-range cruise speed, you might be flying at MMO. There's all sorts of caveats, and usually a combination of non-normal checklists as well as just real-world experience will dictate what speed you decide to fly at. But certainly it's very rare that you'll be flying econ speed in that situation. So that's basically a cost index. It's a way of airlines flying as economically as possible, which is minimizing cost and helping to maximize profit for the flight. And of course, there's times where we no longer apply it because cost is no longer the objective of that flight. So I hope that clears it up. That question came from one of the previous videos. So if you do have any questions about this, drop them in. And if I think it's a good question, I'll make a future video about it. And once again, thank you very much for tuning in. I'll see you on the next one.